relatively new BA starting work with a new team on a new project, are you wondering what to expect? Or perhaps you're an experienced BA and you're changing teams and you've heard that they do things a little differently than you're used to. My name is Stephanie Lockman-Doucette, and as someone who has worked in over 30 different teams in many different industries and experienced many different corporate cultures, it's my pleasure to share with you my personal and practical perspective on how these projects work and how the role of the business analyst changes depending upon whether you're with a traditional team that follows a predictive approach like the Waterfall, Iterative, or Spiral model, or perhaps you're going to work with an Agile team that follows an adaptive approach like Kanban, Scrum, or SAFe. While there are many similarities, there are also several differences, and it's important that you understand what they are and how to work in those different teams. What you are about to listen to is a live recording of an interactive session I facilitated with the IIBA Ottawa Outaouais chapter on November 16, 2021. During the presentation, I provided a little bit of theory and background about the various project approaches and animation to help the participants understand and see how the actual project approaches work. There's also a little bit of practical experience and practical perspective on what it's like for a BA working on the inside of each of those different project teams. Now, before we get going, remember, if you like what you see, click that thumbs up icon and subscribe.
Today, we're going to be talking about 5 different project approaches and how BAs take on different responsibilities and play a different role when they're working in those different project approaches. Because yes, it's about requirements and engaging stakeholders, but you do it in a slightly different way depending upon the project. So we're going to be talking about 5 different approaches: the traditional waterfall approach, a spiral or iterative approach, and then a couple of agile approaches. Most people think Scrum is the only agile approach. Well, actually, there's many different agile approaches. We're going to talk about Scrum, Kanban, and SAFe. All of these approaches are valid depending upon the context of your industry and your organization and the nature of the product or the problem that you're trying to solve. So it really has a number of different factors to consider. We're going to be talking about all of that, as well as how the IIBA role or how the BA role changes depending upon the team you're working with. All right, let's start with those predictive approaches, the waterfall and the spiral model, or the phased model. Most of us have experience with the waterfall. We live in a government town. The government is risk adverse. They like knowing exactly what they're going to get, when they're going to get it. So they like having a detailed requirement document with some use cases and itemized requirements. And from that, you pass it to the design team and they start looking about database designs and workflows and user interface layouts and all that sort of stuff. But they don't implement anything. They agree that that design is accurate. Then you proceed to implementation, where you actually build it. And then you verify it and then you release it. Yay, we're done. And then you go, it's off to maintenance. So this is the approach that people used to be taught in software engineering courses. I'm not sure if there's anybody that's a CS grad out there, but that's the approach that I was taught when I went through university. And it generally is a sequential approach, and it works well if you're in an industry where there's not a lot of change, where it is risk adverse, and technology doesn't change very much. So like it started with NASA. It started with civil engineering. It makes sense if you're building a 30-story office tower that you know exactly what the requirements are and the design are, because there's certain amounts of engineering that need to go in to making a 30-story tower versus a 10-story tower. So when you're a BA in a waterfall type of a project, you're going to be gathering and documenting the requirements for the entire product, whatever it is that you're completing. And then you have to be managing the requirements through the life cycle, because requirements change, clients change their mind. That's okay. They have to be able to deal with change. And you're going to be supporting the PM because the project manager is going to be asking you for input on this and input on that, and you're going to be feeding all sorts of details to all the different stakeholders. Most importantly, you are a translator. You're translating to the development team. You're translating from the business stakeholders. You're translating to suppliers. I never knew I could speak so many languages and all speaking English. But I've learned how to speak database and user interface and business and accounting, and I've learned all of these different contexts. That's the fun of being a BA. Of course, there's a lot of time spent clarifying requirements during the development of the product, during the testing phase. And I have not actually been involved in doing any acceptance tests, but I know that some BAs often do get pulled into that verification phase to run some user acceptance testing to say, yes, this meets the requirement. And after the release, you might get called in to say, well, have we actually accomplished what we set out to do? Did we achieve those benefits? Did we see the change in the operations that we were expecting? Is the system performing as expected? Now, once again, I have never been called in to do that, but theoretically, I could be called in to do that. Now, does anybody want to speak up and say, yes, this makes sense? Yes, I've lived this, or no, my experience has been very different.
I've done lots of that.
All right, Alec, good. Yeah, Waterfall is a traditional government approach. Now, there is a lot of pressure to move towards an Agile approach, which we'll be talking about soon, but this is pretty standard when you're talking about the big systems. Now, here's a quick little animation to show you what it looks like. So there's a product launch, the BA writes a bunch of requirements, and then they sign off and say, yep, requirements look good. Now let's do some design documents. So the design team gets engaged, they write a bunch of different design documents, and they do a design review, and they say, okay, design's good. And then maybe somebody on the database team or on the hardware team will get involved writing some code for the back end, and then they write the user interface or the front end, and they get all of those components, and they say, okay, code complete, now we're going to test it all. Notice how everything moves in chunks. You have to complete all milestones and all activities of that phase before the whole thing moves on to the next. Testing complete, we've got the release, yay. That's what a waterfall looks like. The role of the BA is, of course, throughout all the different phases. Now, the spiral approach or the phased approach is very much like the waterfall project, except it breaks it down into smaller chunks. And then you iterate and you do the same analysis, design, build, test, analysis, design, build, test, and you loop through the cycle. It looks a little bit like this, where the BA writes, okay, 3 requirements rather than 5. There's 3 documents that go through the design phase, 3 elements that have to go through that back-end implementation, then another 3 elements that have to go through the front end, the user interface implementation, and then testing. And then you'd have to do the next. So you have sort of the first release and the second release, which gives access to the solution, or at least part of the solution, to your stakeholders much faster. They don't have to wait for everything to be complete. They sort of get, well, here's part 1 and there's part 2. Has anybody worked in sort of a phased or iterative approach like this?
Yes, I've done that too.
All right, JF. All right, Alec. Yeah, these are pretty common, right? Like,
Yeah.
Most people realize that, hey, you got a 4-year project. That's a little bit humongous. We got to break it into phases. Let's do it for 12-month releases. And you're saying, oh my gosh, that's still pretty huge. Maybe we can break it into 8 6-month releases. Then you have the client on the opposite end saying, well, but I can't really do much with only that 6-month release here. We'll see how it goes. Some people like the iterative approach. So what's the role of the BA? You're still gathering and documenting requirements, but this time you're doing it for each specific phase. Maybe with understanding the context of what's coming in the future, but you're focusing on that one phase. Yes, you're managing the requirements through their life cycle and supporting the PM. You're the translator, you're clarifying, you're executing the tests, and maybe the after release. So the role of the BA for full waterfall versus spiral is not that much different. It's just a matter of what is your lens, what is your focus, how long in the future are you actually thinking about? Are you focusing on today, or are you focusing more long term?
There's also a whole lot more transition requirements, because typically when you roll out partial like that, you sort of say, well, okay, we're still using the same database. So now we have to bridge between databases and map
Yeah.
those things back and forth, because you're not really replacing a whole piece of something or part of it. So you got to keep the thing functional as you're going through. So
You're
there's
right,
a
yeah.
lot more transition requirements with this approach.
Indeed. Yeah, I suppose because chances are that you haven't planned out your full database, so you need to be able to change your database every single release. And then training, there'll be more training involved. And I think that's when I presented this to a particular client, they were concerned about, well, that means I have to do 8 sets of integration testing and 8 sets of release testing. And they thought all of that churn of doing the releases was too costly. They preferred having one big bang approach. Well,
if it works, it's great. If it doesn't, it's anyway.
And it means the client has to wait 4 years to get their product. So yeah, there's pros and cons. Any other comments on the spiral approach or the iterative approach?
It allows some people to think they're doing agile. Usually that's, they change it slightly and then they boast about doing agile. I've seen that happen.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
It's a nice illusion to have. They feel secure, they feel they've achieved something, and they move on. But
It does, I think, depend upon how short those phases are. Yeah, you're right. A lot of people think that a 6-month release is an agile release, and maybe it's more the method. You're right, Jaya. So now we're going to sort of have one last little comment here on the waterfall approach before we flip into the agile mode. All right, so we've already done our Q&A. So just a quick note, traditional engineering versus system engineering. The traditional engineering, like that, the civic engineer that's designing a high rise, they have some well understood techniques and a very well understand discipline. They're usually working on a single release, although they might do it in a phase. I grew up in Edmonton, Alberta, and they had West Edmonton Mall, and they did it originally in 3 phases, and then they added a 4th phase, and then they added a 5th phase. So if you architect a building appropriately, you can always extend the breadth of it. Extending the height is a little bit more difficult, but you always have a defined objective, and the technology doesn't change that much. But system engineering, software, very different. Our tools and techniques are always changing. The tools we have today didn't exist 5 years ago. Requirements are difficult to define. The client might not know exactly what they want, can't articulate it. And of course, you're trying to predict where's the world going to be 5 years in the future. Who knows what they're going to really want? Requirements are changing because the economy is changing, the political environment is changing, the environment around us is changing. Who knew 3 years ago, we didn't know about COVID. We wouldn't have planned that we are where we are today, but it has really flipped the world around. On top of that, systems engineering, they've adapted to this whole iterative approach. That's what they expect because they realize that things are changing so quickly. In addition to iterative development, systems engineering has gone to that component-based approach where you can plug and play different modules, you plug and play different hardware. You plug one database in, you take another database out. It doesn't matter whether you're talking Oracle or Sybase or DB2. Well, it kind of does, but you should be able to separate the user interface from that physical layer and still have a solution. And consider as well the fact that we now have people that are located around the world. So you're dealing with language issues, cultural issues, time zone issues, as well as various other political elements that may intersperse with, that may affect the way the team's working. So it is very different. The way that project management, the way that business analysis was kind of put together originally to deal with that traditional approach, and the way it is in the IT space, the way it is now here in 2021 is very different from what was. So it's no wonder that a lot of the old approaches don't work. Traditional approaches work well when the outcome is understood and the environment is constant. But we know that IT is not like that. The client may have a difficult time articulating what they want. External factors are always changing. The environment is always changing. So how do you deal with all of this change? That's where the agile approaches come in, because they're iterative, they're adaptive. They allow you to have that vision of where you want to go. But if something doesn't work out, well, okay, you detour and you still keep working towards your general objective. We're going to be talking about Scrum, Kanban, and the scaled agile framework. Okay, so Agile Manifesto was defined back in 2001. It's very simply defined as various approaches to software development under which requirements and solutions evolve through collaborative effort of self-organizing and cross-functional teams and their customers or the end users. It advocates adaptive planning, evolutionary development, early delivery, and continual improvement. And it also encourages rapid and flexible response to change. That's how it's defined in 2001. It's 20 years ago. A lot of people are still thinking that Agile is relatively new. It's been around for a while. And if I have to think back to when I did my undergraduate degree, and the professor assigned us in groups of 3 and 4, said, there's a project, go off and do it. We didn't understand Waterfall. We didn't do Waterfall. We did the Agile approach. We were adaptive, we were iterative, we were collaborative. So I think most people learn the Agile approach instinctually, and we know how to apply it as second nature. And then we're sort of taught and forced into that Waterfall approach. But let's take a look at this and take it apart bit by bit, because there's some key components in here that are important for everybody to understand. And then I'm going to make a little extension to the definition. So collaborative effort of self-organizing cross-functional teams and their customers, including end users. When I talk to some people about this, that gets them all squirrely. It's like, well, our end customers, we don't want to talk to them. We have too many of them. How are we going to focus on this? But it is important to have that collaboration, to have the end users talking to the developers, talking to the designers, and eliminating all the filters that happen in between. Yeah, you're not going to have 100 end customers talking towards your development team. You may have a select subset, 1 or 2 key customers, or you might have a product owner. That's the role of the product owner, is to be the voice of the customer. So it's important to get that direct action, that direct communication between the development team and the customer, so that they can understand each other and they can ask the right questions. As well as, let's talk a little bit about the self-organizing cross-functional teams here. Some teams have your database person, your user interface person, your tester, your technical writer. Everybody has their box, everybody has their role, and they don't stray. And that works in some teams, but it also gets difficult, because what happens when the DBA has to go on vacation? Well, you need somebody else to take that role, but if you don't have anybody else in DBA, it doesn't work. So part of the key element of a cross-functional self-organizing team is that you do have a lot of blended skills. You have more people that are sort of jack of all trades and can play multiple roles, as opposed to people that are focused in only one specific skill set. That enables much greater flexibility if you can have 2 or 3 people that can take that DBA role, or 6 people that can do Java coding. And yes, the BA sometimes doubles as a tester, and yes, sometimes the tester doubles as a technical writer. Doesn't mean that they're optimal at that skill, but they are at least competent and capable. As well as self-organizing, recognizing that the team itself can figure out the best way that it should work. It can define its own rules, its own processes, its own method. Yes, within some boundaries, but it takes advantage of the characteristics, the culture, the organization, and figure out what works for them. Any comments on that? All right, next one. Adaptive planning, evolutionary development, early delivery, and continual improvement. Okay, so I use this example all the time of, you need to know where you're going. So if we have to plot a course between here and Calgary, usually I say Vancouver, but right now Vancouver is isolated from the rest of the country, so we're going to stop in Calgary instead. We need to know that's our destination, but we don't necessarily know how we're going to get there. So we need to have a plan, yes, but we should have that plan as adaptable. Are we going to take the bus, the train? It doesn't really matter. I could take a boat from here to Kingston, and then from there I could hook up on a bus. Depending upon the situation, I will adapt my plan. I know the general direction, but it will adapt. And then it has to evolve, because there could be a change where it's like, okay, well, we know we want to go to Calgary, but hey, there's a good opportunity over in Edmonton. Let's take a detour up to Edmonton as well. So you can have your plan, you can adapt it, you can evolve it. And yes, it's important to have that delivery, to give the customer an element of, this is what you're going to get. Do you like it? Yes and no. And then change your approach if it's not what they want. Being flexible and adaptable to change. This is a fundamental piece of Agile. You don't have the formal contract. You don't have requirements. Yes, you do have some, but they're a little bit loose and they're a little bit flexible, and they can evolve and they can change. Now, where I want to make a slight modification to the definition of Agile is this keyword here, software development. Because yes, Agile Manifesto was created by a bunch of software guys, but Agile can be more than just software, more than just IT. I view it as solution development and delivery. So this could be anything. This could be policy. This could be a program. This could be a workshop. This could be, I built my house in an Agile manner. So it's really a mindset. And I think IIBA has it right when they say an Agile mindset is the way you approach a project. All right, so what is Agile values, or what's important to Agile? It really is about valuing the individuals and interactions, the working solution, the customer collaboration, and responding to change. There still are processes and tools. I remember when people first started thinking about Agile and said, yay, I don't have to write requirement documents anymore. Well, no, that's not true. You still have to write requirements, but you write just enough, just in time, in a manner that makes sense to your stakeholders so that it's appropriate for the context of the solution. There's no standard format. It doesn't have to be piles long, or it doesn't have to have a bunch of different diagrams and tables that don't make sense. What you're showing is that you get the documentation that's relevant. And yes, there's still processes. I think there's actually more processes in an Agile team than there is in a non-Agile team before you have sprint planning and sprint kickoff and the daily Scrum meetings, and then you have the demo and technical review and a retrospective. By the time I get all of those Agile meetings in my calendar, I'm thinking there's not a lot of time for work, but there is still time for work. It all works very well. So yes, there's processes, there's tools, there's documentation, but it's more important that you're working towards that solution that brings value to the client, and that you're adapting to the client and what their needs are. Okay, so everybody normally asks me, how does this actually work? In a Scrum team, it's iterative and incremental, yes. Generally used for software projects and IT projects, but it can be used for pretty much anything. And there's generally three types of players, three roles. There's your Scrum Master, who's supposed to be a coach or a guide. They're not supposed to be a manager, but I usually find that Scrum Masters kind of do have a manager role, or at least a team lead type of role, even though they're not by the textbook supposed to have that type of a role. There's somebody called a product owner who represents that client, that end vision of what it is that the team is supposed to be building. And then there is the team, that cross-functional team that completes the work. Notice that there's no specific articulation of the skill set for that team. So the theory says that there's no need to delineate the team member functionality between all the different roles within a team, that everybody can do every task. Now I want to pose a question to you. Do you think that that is feasible, realistic, that everybody can do every task on a team?
No.
All right, let's have some conversation about why is that not realistic?
I think because some people are going to be a lot better than others. Some people have no interest. I mean, the DBA is a good example. If you're not a DBA, I'm not. And,
Right.
you know, you get there and you pretty much, you know, you have to learn by keeping your mouth shut that what these people know and what they're doing, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
not everybody's going to have that, right? And you start building it, and the DBA comes back and goes, "What are you doing?" Right? That's crazy, right? So
Yeah, yeah. There is, I think, an element here where the Scrum methodology, when it was defined in the Agile Manifesto by a bunch of software people, they made the assumption that everybody on the Scrum team was a software person. That is one of their underlying assumptions, that they had 6 Java programmers or 6 visual BA people. We know in our world, that's practically doesn't happen. Like particularly in the government environment, we have multi-skilled people because we're developing, we need all those different skills for our project. So I think you need to look at the environment. If you are an IBM, if you're a Microsoft, if you are a small cell phone startup company, maybe you do have a team of just people that do web pages and they're pretty much interchangeable. Maybe you do have a team of people that do JavaScript all day long and you can have them interchange. That doesn't work on all teams, but it does work well on a traditional Scrum team. What you will notice throughout this conversation is that I'm giving you a bunch of different snippets of different types of projects, but I have never met a single team that does everything by the textbook. Everybody chooses bits and pieces of methodology and creates a blended approach for them. So I have never met a Scrum team that looks exactly like this. I have met a lot of teams that say they're doing Scrum, but they're all doing it in a slightly different interpretation. And that's perfectly fine. What's more important is that you do have the approach and the flavor of that iteration and that evolution. All right, let's carry on. So I just want to take a moment to talk about what is iterative, incremental, and responsive to change, because some people get this confused. Imagine that you are an artist and you have your vision of what you're trying to create. You realize you can't do Mona Lisa in an afternoon, so you break it down into a couple of different segments and you paint the first segment and then the second segment and then the third segment. And it's incremental because you're doing bit by bit by bit, but because you have that complete end vision, you're painting that entire part of the picture complete. And then you're doing the next part complete. And that is an incremental approach to making the painting. Now, if you were to do it in an iterative manner, you might sort of say, well, I want to do this picture of a young lady, and you do a pencil sketch. So you do a just basic outline, and then you fill it in a little bit and say, okay, well, that's getting better. And then once again, by the end of the third afternoon, you've got your full Mona Lisa painting. That's iterative, but that's still not responsive because you haven't really changed your picture. You had it the same from beginning to end, although you were working at it from building up. This one is kind of building in silos or in slices. The iterative approach is building it in layers. Now, if you're to combine this, iterative and incremental, you do a little sketch. You say, I'm not quite sure about that position of the hand. Let's change the position of the hand. It's okay to have change. So we pull out the eraser and we re-sketch just the position of the hand. Okay, that looks good. We get some more feedback from our client. They say, oh, I think I'm feeling a little bit peachy today. So they paint the robe in peach and they look at it and say, no, that's just a little bit too bright. She should be a little bit more muted and subdued. So let's change the coloring to gray. That's looking a little bit better, more client feedback. And then you fill in all the fine details. So this is building it a little bit by layer, but giving you that chance for feedback. It's iterative, incremental, and does give you that ability that it's okay to change your image, that it's okay to change the requirement and the end goal. Now let's talk a little bit about some of the key elements of working in a Scrum team. What is that Scrum process? There's a product backlog. This is the entire shopping list of all of the requirements that are known today, but they are prioritized with the most important ones the ones that are most well-defined, that are perhaps next through implementation, they're sitting at the top. The ones that are just figments of imagination, they're sitting at the bottom and they're just a one line. They have no detail other than the thought. And then the sprint team gets together and they say, I think we're going to do these 3 or 5 or 10 different features, 3 or 5 or 10 different user stories. I use those two interchangeably, features, user stories. Some people are very pedantic about the structure and the layout. Once again, that some of the teams are very fussy about the way they describe what's in their sprint backlog. Other teams are not so fussy. But it is up the responsibility of the Scrum team, of the development team, to pick and choose how much they take off of the backlog. They take it from top down. They can't pick from the bottom, but they can choose how many they take off the list. And then they start to work. Sometimes anywhere between 2 to 4 weeks, they set their cadence, they set their rhythm. Most Scrum teams like a 2-week rhythm. I've worked in some organizations where they just can't get it turned around in 2 weeks and they prefer a 3-week or a 4-week rhythm. But you set your rhythm and you work on it consistently. And while you're working during that Scrum cycle, you're getting together while you're working on that sprint cycle, you're having daily Scrum meetings. You have basic 3 questions. What did I accomplish today? What am I planning on doing tomorrow? And what any roadblocks or issues or concerns? And you keep it very, very short and sweet, maybe 10 minutes. You work on that for a couple of weeks, and then you have something that you can demo to the client. And you show them all the cool features that have been implemented, and you ask them any questions that you might have. And then it's for the client to decide, is this good enough to be released? Is it a potentially shippable product? And they might say, yes, it is. Ship it out, release it. Thank you very much. Or no, it's not quite good enough yet. Please send it back for more development. So the team will get together. They'll have a retrospective meeting where they look at what they have done over that past sprint, and they'll say, well, this worked well, this worked well, this is really not working well, we got to change that. And the team does the problem solving to improve their own methods, to improve their own techniques. They get retrospective and they do that analysis at the end of every sprint. So then they come back here and then they have more time to figure out what the backlog is now, and they're going to take a couple items off the backlog here, and then they begin implementing according to the new process, and they do their sprint cycle again for another 2 to 4 weeks and do their demo. The client says, yeah, I like it, let's ship it out. That's good. They have a release, they do a retrospective, and they say, okay, well, we've done our sprint release number 2 here, let's continue on with the backlog, and it becomes a cycle. They usually work on something called the sprint backlog, which is the list of all the tasks that need to be completed in the sprint. Sometimes they have a sprint board on their wall. Sometimes they use tools like Slack or Jira that'll record this in a more electronic, virtual format. What the team does is they take all the different user stories and they identify all the different tasks that are associated with it, and they put all the tasks in that to-do list. And it should be up to the team members to voluntarily self-select which one they put into the doing pile. And it sits there until it's done, and then it gets moved over to the done pile. It's pretty simple. It doesn't get more simple than this. It's very straightforward. Although it can, for somebody that's new to Scrum, it can be a little bit confusing how everything is so self-directed. Here's another little demo for you. So there's 10 different user stories. We got 4 team members, and the sprint plan says we're going to take 5 of those. We break it up into a bunch of different tasks that need to get done. And then they do some design work, they do some back end work, they do some front end work, they do some testing work. It says, yes, those are done, but we still have a few more yet to get happening here. And it's a release. Now, that is a very, very basic approach, and it's not very realistic either, because chances are you're not going to have every team member be able to do all 4 of those different types of activities. As Alex said, not everybody is a DBA, not everybody's trained in JavaScript, so there is going to be a slight different approach here. I'm going to show you another more realistic version here. Once again, 10 user stories, 10 features. They do some sprint planning. Okay, so we have some people that are doing some design work here, some people that are doing back-end work, some people that are doing front-end work. Oh, but this guy here had a little bit of a roadblock, so he couldn't continue on. So that continued over here to this person, and they picked up a different design task. So this is a little bit more realistic. Not all of the tasks are the same duration. Not everybody can do everything, but the team works collaboratively to get things done.
Yes, please.
Is there a question? Okay. Is this making sense to everybody?
Yeah.
All right. Very good. Thank you for the thumbs up, Nancy. Now, when you're on a Scrum team, the management sort of says, well, I know the team is working in this spiral iterative approach, but how do you track what they're actually accomplishing? So there's a couple of different Scrum artifacts that are very important to figure out. The burn down chart is at the core of tracking Scrum. The burn down chart shows the work that the team is doing. It starts with, at the very top here, you've estimated you've got 10 different user stories, assuming it's 20 hours per user story. Okay, so you've got 220 some hours worth of work. Not everybody estimates hours. It could be story points, it could be complexity, a lot of different factors here, but you draw a straight line from here until day 21. Okay, so they've got 4 weeks worth of sprint activity happening. And notice how some of these lines, someday they have not so good, and then they, oh, here's a very productive day, and they're working very well. And gradually, as you get to the end, yes, you do get additional work done, or you do get all of the work done. And occasionally there's extra work that's added, but you still get that one done as well. You can apply this burn down concept either for the sprint or for the whole entire backlog, but it is important to track and sort of see what is going on with the team. Now, you might also hear of a burn up. There's burn down and burn up. This is kind of like the yin and the yang, the half full, the half empty. One of them is tracking the amount of work that is outstanding that has not been started yet. And the other one is tracking the amount of work that has been completed. So, for example, here's that burn down chart, another version of it like we just saw it on the last page. You start at the beginning of the sprint with a great big pile of work. This is the amount of work outstanding. And as you go through the sprint and work gets completed, the burn down chart gets smaller and smaller, and you get near to the end where, hey, everything that needs to be done, there's nothing remaining left. There's nothing outstanding. We have burned it all down. Burning up is looking at the work completed. So as you go from beginning to the end, you get more and more work completed, and you still get in some of this extra work here as well. And so then you're looking at it from, this is how much we've completed. So those people that are pessimistic versus optimistic. Here's a third approach where we're looking at the work that is ready to start, is this green, and then a little bit that's blocked, but we'll figure it out. And then the work that has started is in red, and the work that's finished in blue. And as you progress over the course of a week, then everything that is ready, it's been consumed into the sprint. There are some things that are blocked, but they all get blocked by the end of the sprint. All of the work has been started, and most of the work has been finished. There's a little bit here in red that is left over, and that's going to have to carry over to the next sprint. So which of these approaches is going to work for you is really up to you and your team and what tool you're using. Okay, so Kwasi has posed a question here. Is user stories the only way or technique to be used in documenting Agile related development projects? Absolutely not. To be personally, confession, I hate user stories because to me, they don't have enough detail in them. Like how much can a one-liner have? As a doctor or as a manager, I need to be able to generate a report that does this. That's the user story. And then you have to actually put all kinds of detail into it. So usually what I do is I don't worry about keeping that user story format. I just say we're doing a management report, and then I write a mini specification that is all the details about what that mini report is going to be. You sort of have to be careful because yes, you want to make sure this is another thing where one team I was at was very particular. The user story needs to be finished within the scope of a sprint. Another team I worked with said, no, it's okay. Make it as big as it needs to be. If it has to carry on to the next sprint, that's okay. It's different teams, different methodologies. I wasn't Scrum Master at that time, so there wasn't much point in making a debate out of it. Definitely, you have to choose the tools, the techniques, the format, whether it's text, whether it's diagram, whatever you want, whatever works for your team and your stakeholders. So hope that works for you, Kawasi. And if there's anybody else, feel free to jump out into the conversation or send me a chat message and I will get to you when I notice it. Okay, let's continue on here. So we talked about burn up, burn down. Velocity is another type of metric that Scrum teams will measure. Velocity is something that you need to have a set of sprints, and you need to have at least 3 sprints to be able to do this meaningfully. This is another chart where we are tracking the amount of work in a team. The amount of work on top of the bar here is amount of work that was started or known at the start of the project. So they had 300, they're calling it effort units in headaches. Call them user stories, call them features, they call them headaches, that's okay. So they have 300 feature points, 300 stories that they need to work on. And at the end of the first sprint, they've knocked down about 50 of them. So they now only have 250. At the end of the second sprint, they're now down to 175. So this red line here is tracking the velocity. It's tracking the average amount of work that a team is able to complete. And yet, sometimes they complete more, sometimes they complete less, but gradually over time, you will begin to be able to track the amount of work that is possible for a team to be able to complete. Now, what happens below this black line are all those changes when the product owner says, you know, I've got this additional feature and I've got that additional feature, and can you squish this one in too? And as BAs, we say, yeah, of course we can do that. So we document our user requirements, we put them into a story, we put it into the backlog, and yes, our backlog keeps growing and growing and growing. And then the project manager pipes up and says, you know, Steph, if you don't stop with these requirements, we won't be able to release until sprint 17. It's the intersection of the velocity that the team is working at, this red line, and the amount of new work that the BAs are putting into the pipeline says we're not going to be able to release until sprint 17. And you realize that, okay, that's too long. The market can't take it. The client needs a release sooner. I agree that we're going to put back a line here. That's a cold stop. That's a freeze on the requirements. We're not taking any new requirements. If there are new requirements, they're going into a next backlog for a next release. And so then we can theoretically release on sprint 13. Everybody okay with that? Okay, moving on. So what is the role of a BA in a Scrum team? It really depends upon the size of the Scrum team. I worked on a Scrum team where there was 3 of us. There was me as a BA, there was somebody doing database work and somebody doing ETL. I worked on BI projects. So in that case, yeah, as a BA, I was playing the product owner as well. And the DBA was doing the DBA work, and the transformation work was the transformation work. And I had a client, I had a product owner. So I guess there was, I guess I had the end client. So I guess there was 4 of us. I've also worked on teams where much larger. I've worked on teams where there's 300 people in the development team. That's going to be a story for a later day. But if you have a team of 10, you can definitely have a Scrum Master and a product owner and maybe a team of BAs that are working with the product owner and a team of developers. So you need to understand who all the different players are, and that'll help you slice and dice and make sure who's playing which role. Generally, the product owner will manage the backlog. But if there is no separate product owner, if the BA and the product owner are the same person, then it's your responsibility to manage the backlog. Add those new features in, prioritize them, shuffle the product backlog, refine the requirement, groom those stories, making sure that they're ready for implementation. Then, yeah, you're going to have to support the Scrum Master and or the product manager and or the product owner. Once again, BAs, we tend to support a bunch of people and we give them the information that's required. You're that translator role again, clarifying the requirements, executing the acceptance tests. Oops, jumped a little too fast there. So there's still a lot of work. A lot of it's similar to what we've spoken about before. But the key sentiment of what makes Scrum different from Waterfall is the speed. It's the intensity. You're doing a release. You're doing a new sprint every 2 weeks. You're going to have stories coming at you left and right. You don't have a lot of time to write manuals of documentation. You're going to have a quick little specification that's maybe 5-10 pages. That's it. That's all. You really need to learn how to cut and paste and separate different elements of capabilities and different elements of features. It's called decomposition. As BAs, we're pretty good at decomposition, but we have to be excellent at decomposition when we're in a Scrum team. Now, closely related to Scrum, but a different methodology is Kanban. A lot of teams kind of feel like this. They got too many tasks. They're going every which way, but Kanban can really help. Because Kanban is about eliminating work in progress and it's about eliminating waste. How many times do you get caught working on a specification and then, well, okay, I have to park this over here and I've got to work on this one today. I'm juggling about 5 different things at work right now, and everyone is a different priority every single day, and it's like my head is spinning. But Kanban, you're eliminating all of that work in progress and you're working on one thing at a time. Now, before we go into what that methodology is, here's a quick little summary that gives you a better understanding of some of the differences between Scrum and Kanban. Scrum has a time box. You have that sprint every 2 weeks, every 4 weeks, whatever the time box is, but you're on a rhythm. You have a regular, repeatable rhythm. You can understand what that rhythm is, and you can begin to work with it. Kanban, the concept of a time box does not exist. In Scrum, you're working for those small stories or those small features that can be theoretically completed within the scope of the sprint. When Kanban, more you're focusing on meaningful features and meaningful work. So they could be a little bit larger. In the Scrum team, we've talked about everybody should be theoretically cross-functional. Everybody can do every single task. But in a Kanban team, they respect the skill differences between people. So you do have the DBA, you have the back-end developer, the front-end developer, the technical writer, the user interface person. In the Scrum team, you're managing the velocity. How much can the team do per sprint? It's moving it, moving it, moving it. So in Kanban, you measure cycle time, how long it takes to get from beginning to end. So Kanban comes from Japanese. It stands for signboard. There's once again a number of different tools that you can use that work in an agile way for Kanban. I like to think of Kanban as kind of like an assembly line. It's taking IT, it's taking software, and it's turning into widgets and assemblies. So you still have your backlog, and then you have a number of items that have been selected, and then they're sort of waiting in the wings. They're hovering, they're next. Then you have these things that are in analysis. There's 2 that are actively going through analysis right now. They're getting refined. And then when the analysis is done, it's moved over here to the done column. And then the development team, they can take things when they're ready. And they will be doing a certain amount of development. And then it'll go to the done pile, which will be ready for the testing team to pick it up. And then when the testing team is done, it moves over here. There's a couple of other little nuances here that I want to share with you. See these little numbers up on top? That's a way of managing the flow, saying no more than 3 items in testing at one time, no more than 5 elements in development at one time. That way you don't overwhelm a single team with a bunch of different work that they need to do. But we know that there's always the VP that says, I've got this emergency, this client really needs this week. So what do? Well, there is an expedite line here, which says that high priority rush item can come down here. And if there happens to be something down here, well, the development team is going to work on this particular task that's in the expedite lane first before it works on those 3 other development tasks. And then when it's ready, they move it over here to the testing team. And there's a lot of communication, a lot of collaboration within the team to make sure that happens. Once again, another little demo for you. So it starts with, you've got the first requirement, it goes to done, then the second requirement, and then it moves to done. Notice how we've now got 3 different requirements moving through the pipeline. Now we've got 4 different requirements moving through the pipeline. Well, the first one's been released. Now the second one's been released. So the third one's been released, and now the fourth one's been released. For those of you that are kind of thinking, well, Scrum or Kanban, which would I want to use when? They both work, but they both have maybe some preferences. As I said, Scrum works well when you have a bunch of team members that are all doing the same thing. So it works well when you're in a software team. You've got 10 people that are coding. It works dandy. Kanban works better in a BI context. So for example, I was doing the requirements. I had somebody doing development. I had somebody doing the ETL. We had somebody doing the reports. And what ended up happening was we didn't really, we tried to sort of do all of those elements within one sprint. That got a little bit tricky. So what we ended up doing was I would do requirements in one sprint and get it reviewed. Then that particular requirement would move into the DBA, and the DBA would work on it for a sprint and make sure that the model was correct. And then we'd pass it off to the ETL person, and they'd work on it for a sprint, while the DBA was working on a second model, and I was working on requirements for a third feature. And then we had the report development happening this way. So we sort of chunked it. Each difference hop of the Kanban was done by a different function. Now I was working on a team where we kind of combined. We had Scrum and Kanban. We called it, some people call it Scrumban. I haven't talked to you about Scrumban today, but I think, hoping you can imagine, we've talked about the Scrum methodology. Now we're talking about the Kanban methodology. They both work, but they need to be applied in a context that makes sense. So what are the other roles on the team? This is how we're going to have to figure out what is the role of the BA. It depends upon the other players. Once again, if there's no product owner and no project manager, the BA is going to be the one managing the backlog. Refining the requirements, supporting the team, the translator. Notice those are all the same. Any questions on that before we jump into SAFe? Okay, here we go. So Scrum and Kanban work well when you've got a small team. You can keep the communications tight, you can keep the communications local, and you're always working on the one product. But we all know that a team of 10 can't do very much. Sometimes you need large teams, teams of 20, teams of 50, teams of 200. So how do you do Agile in the large? That's where SAFe comes in. Now, I'm going to take apart this picture here little bit by little bit, because it's important that you understand how it all fits together. Down here at the bottom, this is the team level. And notice how you have some teams that are working in a Kanban approach, some teams that are working in a Scrum approach. They have their development team, they have a product team, they have a Scrum master. Doesn't matter whether you're talking software, firmware, hardware, but everybody is working in an Agile approach. And it's really up to the specific team to choose whatever approach that they are working on. There still is various backlogs that they are managing, but the key point is that all of these different teams need to work together on the same cadence, on the same frequency. So whether it's a 2-week interval or 4-week interval doesn't really matter, but you need to work together at the same time because those components are probably binary compatible. They have to fit together. You're going to have some sprints that are considered enabler sprints, where you have to make a foundation piece that is going to be consumed by the second level, that is going to be consumed by the third level. And that's why they have to be at the same level. When I was working with Cognos many, many years ago, we had a 10-level architecture. That sounds more complex. It was complex, but we had a 10-level architecture. We had a 2-week sprint cycle. So how are we all going to make this work? So everybody knew which day that they were working on. And my team was responsible for, I was level 0. I had to deliver my code into the software library so that everybody else could use it on a Monday. And then everybody else could adapt to it. And then the next level had to deliver their code on Tuesday. And then the next team had to deliver their code on Wednesday. And meanwhile, once I delivered my code, I was jumping ahead to get ready for the next. We were planning. We had our planning element where we knew what was coming. We knew what the schedule was. We had a lot of conversations, but then the team would work. And we would all work together to make sure that, because I was a foundation piece, that I was the first one in before the next team came, before the next team came in. We were all working together, and we worked on about 12 different iterations before we would release. So it wasn't truly, we weren't releasing every week to the field because that would have been a little bit busy when you have 200 people, but we were still releasing once a quarter. And it worked out pretty well. Up at the top here, we had the business owners and the product management and the system architects, and they were defining things on a larger scale, on a more holistic scale. They were setting the guidelines that we were then putting into the backlog that we were implementing. They were defining the product increment suggestions or product increment objectives, and they were helping us making sure that we were doing the right things in the right buckets. They would say, well, I need this particular capability in the Q1 release. I need this capability in the Q2 release. I need this capability in Q3. And then once we had the bucket of capabilities that were required per quarter, it was up to us as a development team to figure out, well, I can do this in sprint 1, I can do this in sprint 2, and then you guys can have it available for, because you're going to need to integrate with it in sprint 5. And then we were sure that we could deliver it all by the end of the 12th sprint, which was the end of the quarter. And that worked out quite well for us. We didn't call it the Scaled Agile framework. We were doing Scaled Agile long before it was called that. But that's just, when I'm looking at this diagram, that's essentially what we were doing when I was working at Cognos. Now, taking this up a level, forgot about this. So there's a common cadence, which we've spoken about, and it is essential that the team has a common architecture. You need to be using the same underlying components. And I think that that's the key element that distinguishes sort of one release train cycle versus another release train. Think of Microsoft. They have the Microsoft M365 architecture. Everything that fits onto that architecture is working on a common cadence, on a common release cycle. They have the M365 M365 environment, but they also have other architectures. They've got Azure. They've got various database architectures that they are supporting at the corporate level, at the server level, which is a little bit different from what we need to support at the home or the individual level. So that's a different architecture. It can be on a different release train, on a different cycle, on a different calendar. So this is one of those distinguishing characteristics where you need to identify if there are components that are common, they need to be on the same architecture, the same release train, the same calendar. If they're separate, they can be doing what they want on their own time frame. Does that make sense to everybody so far? All right, I'm taking silence as acceptance here, or I put everybody to sleep.
Yeah, it's
Now-
great. Thank you.
That's okay. So this just adds an extra level to it, where you have, once again, the solution architecture, the solution management. They're worried a little bit more about integration with third parties. At some point in time, when you move from the team to the program to the large solution, and you're integrating all the different components from different teams and different providers, it gets a little bit more complex. Generally, BAs work down here at the team level, but as you've been a BA for a while, you might want to explore the product ownership role, or you might want to move into product management role, or business owner, or solution management. And this is where the career path of a BA can really take off. You don't have to stay with just a single job title. You can grow in many different directions. So before I continue on with that thought, what is the role of a BA in this safe environment? You could be the BA in the Scrum team. You could be a BA in a Kanban team. You could be a product owner or a manager, a solution manager, or a business owner. JF, you've got your hand up, sir.
Yeah, thanks. Just going back quickly, can you explain the difference between product management and product ownership in 30 seconds?
Yeah.
You can. I have a big debate back at work about that one, so I want to steal your idea and pass it off as mine.
Well, I'm going to go from my practical experience rather than what I have seen in a, I've never been officially taught what the definition of a product manager is. I've just lived in a product management environment. So in my particular realm, product owners are a little bit more internally focused. I view them more as somebody that is focused on, I guess, capabilities of the functionality and what's happening for, I don't know, like kind of a quasi-BA-ish, but a little bit more strategic. Product management to me is about creating a product that is going to be sold outside the company. And so you have to understand the market, you have to understand sales, you have to understand the needs of the world, the globe. Whereas product owner to me is making the best product that you can, maybe having a little bit more insular perspective on it. That's personal take. I have not had product owner training. I have not had product manager training. That's just anecdotes from what I've seen over my career. Okay, so let's carry on here. I wanted to just quickly visit this chart that IIBA published a few weeks ago or months ago now. And I love this when this came out because some people think that BAs only have one career track. And this shows that actually there's many different career tracks that a BA can take. And in today's discussion, we've spoken about this traditional business analysis track where you could be a business analysis professional, or you become a business analysis team leader and maybe go into enterprise architecture. We've also spoken about this agile career track where you could be a product owner, maybe evolve to a release train engineer or scrum master or business technologist, but you can also be a BA in an agile space. That is perfectly reasonable and acceptable. Or you could evolve into this product management path where you're a product manager, maybe become a portfolio manager responsible for many products, and project manager. And they put project manager and product manager here on the same line. Not sure about that, but that's what they did. That's okay. So we've covered a lot of different elements here. Now, quick review, summary on one page, what we've talked about today. The waterfall approach, the spiral approach, Scrum, Kanban, and SAFe. That supporting others, the translator, clarifying requirements, that is consistent across all the different modes. Whether you're executing test cases is consistent across the modes. Working after a release, not so relevant in the agile spaces, might be relevant in the waterfall approach to say, and spiral approach to say, did you accomplish things? Now, when it comes to requirements, It really comes down to the timeline, the scope. When you're in that waterfall, you're looking for the full project. When you're in the agile space, you're really just looking a couple of features at a time, very focused on what's immediately here in front of me. As a BA working in the traditional space, you're managing the requirements and the requirement life cycle and requirement changes. When you're working in the agile space, it's called a backlog. It's still requirements, but you're just focused on backlog and it's prioritized. When you're in safe space, you need to be thinking about the roadmap and where things are going and how they all fit together. Stuart, you had a question.
Yeah, just a comment about the after release section. What I found recently is that in a fairly small team, we end up doing support type tasks as well. So we do new user stories, we do bugs and other types of fixes. And the after release end up being bugs entered into the backlog and prioritized and groomed as part of the backlog grooming. And then they get mixed in with the sprint.
True enough. Yes.
From that point of view, the after release is very much a part of our hybrid agile approach.
Okay, so I'm going to clarify this a little bit. Benefit realization, and this is benefit realization, and this is going to be bugs in backlog. Because you're right, that's essentially what it boils down to. It's a slightly different activity, slightly different interpretation, I guess, is one way of putting it.
It is for the it's different for the BA or the developer, right? By the time it's different for the BA, by the time it gets to the developer, it's been documented as a similar level of clarity as a user story, right? It's a task for the developer.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it doesn't really any bugs just become a new user story.
Exactly.
For sure.
And what we've been able to do is train our clients to make it a reproducible. When they report the bug, it's reproducible, so that our developers have something to build on and our testers have something to build on.
Oh, for sure. Yes, that reproducible, that's critical. You have to be able to document the steps to reproduce the problem. Well done. Well done. Any other comments on this summary chart? Okay, then I'm just going to say the one key takeaway that I want you to remember at the end of today's presentation. I know we've talked about a lot. We've got 5 different approaches and many different techniques. There's no fixed rule about project approach or the role of the BA. There's some basic methodology out there, but everybody's going to do their own thing. You're going to have different project approaches depending upon the context of which industry you're working in, the socioeconomic factors around that particular project, the risk sensitivity or tolerance of your organization, and other things that need to be considered. So what might work? The approach we used at Cognos isn't going to work in the government. The approach that I used when I was at Global Affairs isn't going to work when I'm at Shared Services. So I need to look at all of those factors and what makes sense in the context of that organization and that project. And then also looking at the different players and what's the role of the BA? Is there a product owner? Is there a project manager? Is this a big team? Is this a little team? Because depending upon all of those different factors, my role could be very narrow or very broad. I could have a lot of different responsibilities and do a lot of different components and tasks within a team, or I could have a very specific task. Any comments on that? Or comments, questions in general?
I have another one. I guess I'll just speak up.
Go ahead, Stuart.
What would your comments be about the difference between a product owner and a client of the software, the major user?
Okay, yes. Well, the client is the client. They're the one that's using it. So they can definitely say what they want and what they need. I think it's a matter of in my world, a product owner is a part of the Scrum team or part of the Agile team, and they are the one that is in there creating the user stories. Maybe not refining them to the level of specification, but they're the one that are identifying the requirements and prioritizing the requirements. So when I was at Global Affairs, I had a product owner. Well, I guess he's the client. I had the product owner title, and he was the client. And I met with him daily. Like, he was super amazing. He was right there. He was engaged. He attended all of our Scrum meetings. But I was the one that was taking his ideas and his thoughts, and I was scribing them as user stories. And I was the one that was managing the backlog. And I was the one that was promoting the tickets and the tasks as they went to complete in the various stages. So I was taking his thoughts, but I was the fingers on the keyboard, and I was managing it through its process. So that's how my life experience as a product owner has been. Some other product owners, I'm sure, would take it a little bit differently. I think, as I said, it varies based upon the organization. How do you think about that?
I'm debating about how to get our clients more involved, but in our daily scrums possibly, or I don't know. The problem or the challenge would be that the daily scrums end up being rather technical, and I don't really want to expose them to that. But we do have a lot of talk about prioritization, and okay, a developer says, I'm finished this, what do you want me to do next? And if the backlog is groomed properly, and yeah, okay, pick the next one and go. But it's not always that clear cut, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I guess my question would be, how often is there extra work, and are you guys taking enough work into your sprint to begin with? Maybe you need to take a few more stories. What we did in our, when I was at Global Affairs, is we sort of said, okay, this is the key set of features that we want to do, and we're going to take one or two extra that are gravy. They're not officially part of the sprint, but if there's extra capacity, you can work on those ones.
I absolutely, that's a great way of doing it. In this case, I had a very underperforming development team that has suddenly gone extremely high performing and caught me off guard.
Oh, really? Well, congratulations.
So it presented a whole different set of challenges, because suddenly they're doing a lot more than what we had originally planned. So now I'm getting into the point of chasing of, okay, well, you completed that in half the time I expected. So we have extra capacity. What are we going to do for the rest of the sprint? Or
well, you're right. You could end the sprint early, depending upon where you're at. That's a possibility as well. For sure.
True, I never thought of that. And formalizing the end of the sprint, I think, is going to be a big part for us as far as the product demos and all that. So anyway, I don't want to dominate too much here.
Okay. Just for those of you that may not be looking at the chat here, JF says that the client blames and the product owner gets the blame. Well, maybe. I guess my experience, the client has been right in there. So I guess it depends upon the relationship you have with your client. My client was very supportive. The product owner, and then Trista says, the product owner sometimes filters the client's ideas and helps them formulate them, acts as a facilitator. Yes, for sure. That's the translator, because the product owner is, or the client is going to be speaking in their business speak. So as a product owner, you're helping take that business speak, and you're helping to sort of translate it into terms that the development team is going to understand. Facilitation is a key role, getting the teams talking to each other, helping them understand each other, speaking the same language. Thanks, everybody, for that code's contributing thoughts. So that really brings it to the end of my presentation.
So there you have it, some practical perspective on 5 different project approaches, quick animations that show how the different teams might work, and an interactive discussion about what it's like to be a BA on the inside of each of those different project teams. It's been my pleasure to share these insights with you today. My name is Stephanie Lockman-Doucette, and this is Projerra, the channel dedicated to practical perspectives in IT business analysis and project management. Please take a moment to click that thumbs up icon and subscribe, and share this video with your friends and colleagues. Chances are that they're wondering about these methods as well. Of course, if you'd like to get your practical perspective direct from me, you're welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn or follow my public pages on Facebook. You can find these links in the notes that accompany this video. Or perhaps you'd like to invite me to give a presentation to your local chapter. If so, please help me get in touch with your leadership so that we can plan an appropriate presentation. Finally, I'd love to hear from you. Do you have questions that you'd like me to answer? Please leave a note in that section below. Until next time, take care.